Welcome with me, Keith Doelling, from the Institut Pasteur, right? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. I don't think I really have to introduce him. Keith received his PhD from NYU, is now in Paris, a postdoc, and I'm a big fan of Keith. And not only because he's investigating oscillations in speech and in music as well, but also because he's one of the people who is aware of all the problems that come with studying oscillations. And some of them being their confoundedness with evoked components, for instance. Another issue being that it's really not clear whether something as rhythmic as oscillations is really so good when you think about processing something as arrhythmic, such as speech. And Keith is, for me, one of the people who's really published on those problems as well, besides producing great original research, really studying those mechanisms. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Keith. Caroline, I asked Caroline to remind me, there's a recording in progress. So in case you don't want to be recorded, please move away from the camera far enough. I don't know what that means. If you don't want to.
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. And we might put all the talks from the language circle online at some point. We haven't really made up our minds yet about that and how. Yeah, but we're just recording it and we'll see how that goes. Okay, Keith. And another thing. We're going tonight for dinner at restaurant Chow or Cow in Dresdner Straße 51. So if you want to join, then just feel free to join.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invite. It's been a very warm welcome here. It's very, appreciate Lars inviting and Carolina for organizing a really nice, great day. So I'm excited to talk to you about my research and a sort of overly strong title that oscillations can be used as a hard-coded rhythmic prior. Okay, so first, let's do an example and something that I think is pretty impressive. This is from the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Perhaps you all remember this, of 2,000 drummers playing in synchrony. Okay, so that's cool. The question that I'm sort of trying to ask today, one way to ask it is to say, what does it take to be that guy? What does it take to be one person in this system of drummers that are playing in synchrony? And I think there are three basic things that I think we can all agree are required here, right? So the first thing is a perceptual system. You have to be able to hear the other drummers around you. Second thing is a motor system. You have to be able to hit the drum. But the last thing, there we go, is that you need an internal model that helps you make predictions of the timings, right? So it's not enough just to hear a sound and react to it. You have to actually make a prediction about when would be the right time and try to hit that as best you can, right? And so the question is sort of, how can we do that using stimuli like speech and music, right? And so one thing, Lars just said speech is aperiodic, and I'm going to tell you that speech is rhythmic, right? Speech and music are rhythmic, right? Okay, it's okay. I'm going to tell you the other thing in a few minutes too, right? So if you take the envelope of a sentence, for example, this sort of nice black line here, and you do a modulation spectrum, you can see this is from Nye's paper, Nye's paper in 2017, and all these black traces are different languages in speech. And you have a nice little peak here at 4 hertz that's consistent across languages. And if you're fluency, it's 4.5 hertz. So you get really specific nowadays. At the same time, all these other ones are music, right? And so that shows that you still have a peak more around 2 hertz. And interestingly, the widths of these two things are actually quite similar, right? And so that's a side note that we should maybe think about, right? So actually, even like music, we agree is rhythmic. And so that means that there's some temporal regularity here that we can use in speech that helps us to actually process the stimulus. Now, there's also a width there, and we're going to talk about sort of how we deal with this kind of uncertainty at the end of this. So that's just the acoustics, but we also have this in linguistic features like syllables, although I guess you can argue whether, depending on who you are, whether syllables are linguistic or not. But you can still see a sort of median duration that's around 200 hertz, and again with a width. Right? So how can we use this sort of temporal regularity in order to better process the stimulus? Okay, so I'm going to argue that we also, from my perspective, what I'm interested in is understanding this at multiple levels. And I'm going to sort of borrow from David Marr in the sense and sort of dumb it down to a sort of version I can understand, which is that you need an understanding of how the system does what it's trying to do, and a question of why the system does what it's trying to do. And so in the case of how, we think of like lots of different kinds of dynamical models of how neurons can interact in order to generate predictions of what's going to happen next. This is something we're going to call like neural dynamics. In the case of why, we think of things like Bayesian models, the idea that we combine predictions with our stimulus in order to bias our perception, or something like predictive coding, which is highly related, of course, that you use the sort of bottom-up input, you subtract your predictions, and what you care about is the error, which allows you to sort of identify what you need to better learn, or what kind of items you should pay more attention to. And so for lack of a better term, I'm going to call this cognition, right? So too strong of a word, can all agree. Okay, so with these, these are sort of my two levels that I want to understand temporal prediction at. And so what I'm going to sort of present in this talk is, first sort of the question about how, what's sort of the role of oscillations in processing of speech and music, and then try to dynamics, and then mapping to the why. And so trying to understand how this oscillatory system can work under Bayesian framework of temporal prediction. And then lastly, if there's time, I'm going to sort of do a kind of aside on how things we're thinking about now in terms of interacting predictions in time and content. So I'm calling that an epilogue, just to new stuff that's exciting and unpublished and probably wrong. Okay, so let's talk about oscillations. It's a weird place to introduce oscillations to you guys, so I'm going to kind of skip through this a bit. But we all know oscillations are about sort of high and low excitability cycles that can expand at different frequencies. So we've sort of been characterized from 40-second cycles to 600 hertz. So we really span the whole range across the whole reasonable range across different brain regions. And one of the things that I find particularly interesting and why I think they're kind of useful is that they seem to be conserved across species, right? So even from the mouse brain to the human brain, the time scales are sort of relatively consistent across different regions. So that suggests that this kind of timing is not just an accident of axonal length, right? It's actually something that is conserved. For our purposes, we're particularly interested in this delta theta range from about 1 hertz to 8 hertz. And that's for two reasons. One is because it's the peak that's most prevalent in music and speech, 1 hertz to 8 hertz, but also because there's evidence that there's resting state activity in those regions at that same rate. So there seems to be already spontaneous activity here at 5 hertz and again, 4 to 8. So what do we use these for? So I'm going to break them down into two overly coarse groups. The first is coordination, and probably one of the most classical versions of how oscillations are used. And this is an example from the place cells, which fire in a phase preceding way, depending on where you're coming from and where you're going. So the trajectory can be sort of decoded from the phase at which neurons fire within an oscillation. Another example is presented in or theorized in working memory, that you hold different items in memory by having them fire in a gamma cycle at a particular phase of theta, right? So that's sort of another version of sort of using temporal coordination to decompose different units. The other sort of grouping is called communication, and thinking particularly about communication through coherence, where you have where you want two brain regions to communicate, they should fire in phase so that they're both excitable at the same time, versus the alternative where you want to ignore that information, you should fire in anti-phase. That's sort of the general theory that you use. And so the idea that I want to propose is that these kinds of things that we use them oscillations for already in brain function are things that we actually need in the process of auditory perception. So both in terms of coordination in time with things like playing music together or processing speech signals, but also in terms of information selection, if you think of things like the cocktail party, right? And there's been evidence that shows that you can do this kind of thing as well. So do oscillations provide the same functions in speech music perception that they have been shown to provide internally? Can these sort of treat the environment as another brain region? So here's a little bit of history. Annelies Giraud and David Popel had developed a theory in 2012 about how we actually use oscillations as a means of temporal organization of this speech processing signal. The idea being that first the system develops a sort of stimulus-driven spike train out of the brainstem, and then is actually processed with a beta oscillation, which tracks the envelope of the stimulus and actually sort of groups it into individual packets, which you can then be sent to decode. Right? So the idea is that you can filter out a lot of the noise of the system and also identify where a syllable would occur before actually having to understand what that word or syllable actually is. And so I did a lot of my PhD work sort of trying to understand that system and see if we could actually find reasonable evidence for it. And so we used MEG, which again, I don't think I have to introduce here, but has a high temporal resolution, low spatial resolution. We can avoid that figure. And here's the example of the one that we have at NYU. It's a supine system. It's me wearing a lab coat because we never get a chance to. We're not scientists without lab coats. And so as you can see, you can present visual stimuli. We can have headphones into the system, and then we get button responses from the subjects. And so the goal here was to say, okay, can we relate these kinds of things, the neural oscillations that we'll record in the MEG data, with the speech envelopes that we're actually feeding into the system? And so I'm going to sort of go over all of this in one slide. So we have two different studies, one in music, one in speech, where we played naturalistic music in one case, and the other case we played their basically phone numbers, 8675319. Okay, so what we did is we take these inputs, and then we look for alignment between, can I move this mouse? So we're trying to look for alignment between the stimulus envelope, the acoustic envelope of the stimulus, and the MEG recording. And what we found in both of these cases was that you find this kind of alignment at relevant units in the stimulus. So for example, in speech, we found it at the syllabic rate, which was around 2 to 4 hertz for these stimuli. And in the case of music, it tracked with the note rate of the stimulus. So we had music from a range of 0.5 to 8 notes per second. We found that for the 8 notes per second stimuli, you saw nice synchrony at 8 hertz. That's the yellow here. At 5 notes per second, you saw nice synchrony at 5 hertz and 0.5 notes per second. Actually, you don't see any synchrony at that rate. It's in fact too low for non-musicians to successfully synchronize, although we found that musicians could. And so, okay, that's nice. It shows that low frequency oscillations synchronize to rhythms. And then the next important question is, does it matter, right? So is it actually relevant for behavior? And in both cases, we again found that neural synchrony predicts perceptual performance. So in this case, in the music case, they had a pitch distortion task that they had to detect. Did the pitch go up or down during the musical piece? And so the ability to do that correlated with your ability to synchronize to the input. And the same thing for intelligibility in the speech case. So the more information you had, the more you were able to synchronize to. Okay, so that's a whirlwind of stuff from this work. I don't want to spend too much time on it unless you guys have any questions about it. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, so then the next question is, okay, we've shown that there's synchronization here, but actually what's driving that synchronization? Is there really a sort of neural oscillator, which is kind of what we've expected, right? We expect that the synchronization effect is the result of a neural oscillator. Our frenemies, no, I'm kidding, our other great colleagues who suggest also that this synchronization can occur just purely by responses to evoked responses to individual notes, right? You can get the same kind of synchronization. The input is rhythmic, so it's not so surprising that the output is rhythmic. Great, fair point. But the question is like from an MEG-I view, which is all, as we know, very coarse, how can we try to tease those two things apart during stimulus processing? And so I should note first that we've done some work that suggests it's more than just passive. So here's an example from work that Shangbin Tang did while he was at NYU, where, sorry for the low resolution on this figure, where he presented pure FM noise to the speakers, the subjects, sorry, at different exponents of 1/f noise. So this is this stimulus that was given. And what he found is that particularly in the theta range, you could see strong activation for the sort of 1.0 exponent and the 1.5 exponent, which are the most natural kind of stimuli that we receive, which in speech is actually part of the signal. That you actually see theta activation at those ranges, right? So even though that's not in the stimulus, it's generated there from the neural signal, right? So it's not purely just a reflection of what's going on. So that's step one. So I just want to add that because I don't want to say like I'm the only person that has ever worked on this kind of problem. But so what we did was to look more and think about, okay, well, actually, what does it mean to have oscillatory behavior? And actually, what do we want to see in this kind of system? What would be different between that and an evoked response? So I'll just show you two videos of what oscillatory synchronization looks like at two different rates. So up here in gray is the stimulus input to the oscillator, and this is the simulation of an oscillation synchronizing. What you can see is that when it first starts, it kind of has to rattle around a bit, but then it will start to settle at a point. And what's particularly interesting is that point is going to be pretty similar, even across different note rates. It will change a little bit, but not very much. And so that we thought that was sort of key point about neural oscillations. It should be synchronizing to a the right excitability moment, right? And so that should be consistent across different kinds of note rates. And so we tried to build models that would allow us to synchronize these, to simulate these kinds of things, and see if the phase at synchronization is consistent across different note rates. Is that clear?
You mean the tuning into?
Say again.
The time until it is really tuned. That's
you mean what about the beginning?
to see whether that is similar.
No, it's to see actually at the end, right? So once you're synchronized, is the time when the note comes in, is that phase of this oscillation the same across different note rates? So we built models. First, we built an evoked model, which was, the idea was to take the stimulus input or the envelope of the stimulus input. We convolve that with sort of typical M100 response, so basically the impulse function of the MEG signal in the auditory cortex. We convolve the two, right? So we get a system output that looks rhythmic, right? This is our problem. On the other case, we take an oscillator version where we take the same stimulus inputs. Now we feed it into a dynamical system which is designed to oscillate based on this input. And then we receive some output which synchronizes to the input. So here are the equations for this oscillator. It's the Wilson-Cowan model, which is a very standard version of an oscillator. That's now from like the 1970s. And so I won't talk about the equation too much, just show you the parameters and say that we are sort of choosing it to be at around 4 hertz at a spontaneous rate. So we don't touch it other than that. Now we feed it some musical stimuli, the same musical stimuli we did in our previous study where we had ranges from 0.55 and 8 notes per second. This is Beethoven, Brahms, and Bach, in case you're interested. This case was all Beethoven. And so then we can take these stimuli, feed them into our models, see if, okay, is this idea about the narrowing of the phase range, is that actually something we can use to discriminate these two models? And it turned out it did. So we took here are just some examples of the inputs and outputs of the evoked model. And I'll show you now the sort of synchronization range. So here, what you're seeing here is now the cycle represented as a circle. The length of these vectors shows how synchronized the model is with the input, and the angle of it shows you the phase of that, right? And so in this case, you can see the evoked model synchronizes very well, but at different rates, depending on, at different phases, depending on the rate of the inputs. On the other hand, here's the oscillator model. You can see that it sort of continues at 4 hertz most of the time. It doesn't really deal well with the 0.5 notes per second condition, but when you get closer and closer to 4 hertz, you get moments of really clear synchrony, and to the point which is well synchronized at 5 notes per second. And here you see a very different kind of effect. Actually, the synchronization is less than what you would see at the evoked response, but the angles are much closer together. And so when you average them together, you get a longer response here. So this metric of the long arrow for high phase concentration versus the short arrow for low phase concentration. So here are some predictions, and now we can look at the actual MEG data of subjects listening to the same stimuli. Right, so what we find is kind of surprising to some extent, right? So we can see the sort of 1 to 5 notes per second, which are sort of highly concentrated, and then the 8 hertz one, which is a bit out of the rate. And so that was a bit surprising. But when you look at the overall predictions, you can see that the oscillator model is like just within the confidence range of the data, whereas the evoked response one is a bit too low, right? And so actually, it seems that we're sort of somewhere in the middle. So let's take this and sort of take stock. So I think what we can clearly say is that the MEG data is more than reactive. It's not just purely passively responding to each individual input. But on the other hand, we think that it's likely the result of a combination of both. We don't say that evoked responses don't exist, right? We say you still are responding to the input, but then on top of that, there's an oscillator problem. So that might be what's going on here, why you're kind of in between the two. And so if that's true, then it should be the case that by reducing evoked responses, we might see a shift in the phase concentration. And so how do we do that? So I gave you an example of drums that have a really hard attack before, and so now we're going to use the sort of example of strings where we have a much slower attack, which will reduce the evoked responses, but hopefully keep the oscillator component just as the same. Okay, so a brief note on how we did that. We take the same music that we used before, and now we generate MIDI versions of them, which are basically just digital sheet music of the music. We take some database of piano notes, and we create the stimulus ourselves. So we use a sort of the typical version, and then we use a gain function that smooths out the onset of the stimulus. So then we put all those things together. We make a sharp attacked stimulus, which sounds like this. Almost music. And then we do the same thing with the smooth version, right? Even less almost music, right? They call it the underwater accordion. So now we have these new stimuli, we get new subjects in, and first I'll show you the sharp attack version, where you can see now same sort of replication of the effect. You know, we're sort of in between oscillator and evoked, but oscillator is doing a little bit better. And then here's the same people listening to the smooth attack version, and now you can see that we're much more aligned. So clearly the oscillator model is doing a better job of predicting this feature of the MEG data. Okay, so that suggests to me that synchrony is designed by a neural oscillator. We showed that phase concentration is a useful metric to distinguish between oscillator and evoked models. We showed that the oscillator system is likely sort of in combination with an evoked signal, as it's sort of in between these two cases. And lastly, that the neural signal, sort of likely contains both oscillator and evoked responses, which are weighted to handle different musical features. So the idea is that you should be able to do the opposite thing, right? You should be able to make a really sharp stimulus that's super random, and you'll get something that looks more like the evoked model in that case, right? And so you can move between these two systems. Although we didn't do that. Okay, so all of this together sort of brought us to this hypothesis that we can use speech rhythm as a means of localizing units in time, and in doing so, map. So, for example, you know, for any kind of signal, you synchronize to the input and break it up by cycles. And so that allows you to sort of then feed each one of these units into a speech decoder, for example, in order to identify what the content actually is. Okay, so now that I've sort of gone over a bit of history, let's talk a bit about you know, how we can actually use this in the case of like temporal prediction, and in particular thinking about Bayesian frameworks. And so by that I kind of mean, like, how would an oscillator, or a human for that matter, handle uncertainty in time in these kinds of cases? So this is work that I did with Florencia Aseneo, who's at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. Has been doing awesome work down there for the past few years. And so we got together and so we looked at sort of the most classic temporal prediction task that there is, which is basically to have a sequence of rhythmic tones, then a final one that's off, and you sort of ask, like, is that tone early or late, right? So this is super standard, and I have no problems with this kind of task. I've used it before, and we found nice findings showing that the ability to be correct on this task depends on delta phase synchronizing to this input. But the problem with it is that whatever model you use to actually figure out how temporal predictions are being made will always give you the same answer. It's a very simple kind of thing, right? So you can say, subtract this one from this one and add that, or take the mean of all of them and add it. And all the time, it will always give you the sort of rhythmic response. And so what we decided to do was to give it a bit of this uncertainty, right? So now there's a sort of expected location for each one of these tones, but you add temporal jitter that's Gaussian, in order so that people can be a little bit uncertain about what's going to happen. We found pretty quickly that this leads to different kinds of predictions at the end, which lead to different responses. And so what I mean by that, first I should say that we're going to ask 3 questions, which is, what do listeners do? Why do they do them? And how do they do it that way? So when we're going to start with what, and when you look at what, you'll find that there are different ways of calculating what the expected location should be, and they'll give you different answers, right? And so here are 2 that we're using, which are kind of standard in the timing field, right? So one is relative timing, which basically means trying to infer the expected locations and then determining the last location relative to this rhythm. In the other case is absolute timing, which ignores the fact that there's an expected location and just takes each value at face value, looks at collects all of the intervals, gets a mean, and adds that to the end. And what you'll find is that you'll get different expectations depending on which one you use. So we added a probe tone, we moved it around, and we asked subjects, is this thing early or late to you? And so then what we were able to do is say, okay, well, actually, let's code this data either by the relative expectation or by the absolute expectation, and then see, how's your logistic function in each one of those cases. The assumption being that the steeper slope will be closer to what you actually do. Right, so this is an example of a subject. It's the same data, right? It's just the x-axis that has changed. That this subject is more of an absolute timing person. Right? Okay, so then the question is, okay, what do people do? So we did it at 3 different rates: 1 Hertz, 2 Hertz, 4 Hertz. And what we find is that we get different effects depending on the frequency. So if you have a 1 Hertz case, people are doing more of the absolute timing kind of measure. In the 2 Hertz case, you're somewhere in the middle. And in the 4 Hertz case, you're significantly doing the rhythm thing, the relative thing. And so that's a bit surprising. We dug a bit deeper and we looked at if we can actually plot these 2 things against each other to see if there's anything else that can explain this result. What we found is that it really depends on your performance overall. That when you're doing worse overall, so now this is sloping for the relative version versus slope of the absolute version. When you're doing relative overall, you're significantly going below the identity line. When you're doing better overall, you're significantly going above the line. And so I'm just going to rotate this so that it's easier for you to see. This is literally just a linear transformation that rotates the data, which here you can see really clearly this dip below 0. That's it's not just return to 0, it's actually 100. So that's a bit bizarre. And so we asked the question, why? And so we built up a model, a Bayesian model, which goes based on like 3 very simple assumptions. The first is that the brain measures temporal intervals with some amount of noise. So given a certain interval, you get some kind of noisy representation. The second is that you make predictions of timing that follow tones expecting rhythmicity. So when given 3 possible tones, you can make an expectation of what the next one's going to be. And then lastly, that you should combine these 2 in order to have the best representation of when things actually occur. So here's our example model. So like on the first tone, you get just a simple measurement of where the tone actually occurs. On the second tone as well, you haven't heard an interval yet, so there's no new expectation. But on the third tone, now you can build an expectation of where things are based on the distance between the previous 2. And that expectation gets stronger and stronger as you get more and more information. Each one biasing their expectation a bit away from the actual measurement. The second thing the model needs is an ability to predict, to actually read out the error between the measurement and the predictions for the final tone in order to say it was early or late. And so here's just two examples of a sensory measurement and prediction and the percent chance of later response, right? So this has sort of both sort of Bayesian aspect and the sort of prediction error component. Okay, so just as a reminder, this is what the human data look like. And then here's the model when you use two different kinds of predictions, either based on the relative version that I mentioned before, or based on the absolute prediction. And you can see that in the absolute prediction case, you get something that looks really similar to what we see in the human data. That you have, the better you're doing, the more you're doing the absolute version, the worse you're doing, the more you're actually doing the relative version. And so we consider this to be basically an evidence of the prior. When you have high sensory noise, you're getting more biased by your predictive information. The other thing that the model allowed us to do is to modulate confidence, right? And so if we have the models go for a version which has less jitter, which allows the model to be more confident about where each tone will occur, we find that there's a longer range in which you can be rhythmic. And so then we ran another study, having subjects doing the 1.2 hertz case, but with a lower jitter that we've used in the 4 hertz case. Then again, you see that kind of effect, you have a longer regime that's really doing the rhythm kind of thing. So it seems to be actually a predictive model which modulates uncertainty well. Okay, so the last question is how? And so this is where things got a little bit tricky. We started by using the same oscillator model that we've used previously to see actually how does this model work in this kind of case. And we found some interesting results. Okay, so what we do is we take like an example stimulus trial, we feed that into the synchrony. We feed that into the oscillator and like modulate the synchrony, and then we see we can grab the phase at the time of the absolute timing prediction or the relative timing prediction. So here's what we find. So we modulated the sort of coupling between them, which basically how strong does the envelope drive the Wilson-Gallon model. What we find is two regimes. Okay.
So, for the online participants, can you please mute your microphones and check whether they're muted? I think we have 1 or 2 participants who haven't muted theirs. Thank you very much.
But also feel free to ask a question if you want. Okay, so what do we find? We find that with reduced coupling parameters, we can build a version. Well, we have a version of this that shows high phase concentration for the absolute version, as opposed to higher coupling battles, which gives you concentration of the relative version. Right. So the same model with one different parameter can give you either of the two things, which is something that's important for a model that's actually going to try to build this up well. And then the second thing we did was to take the phase at probe time, at the time of the tone itself, and try to use that to actually do the task. Can we actually tell me whether it's early or late? And we again found this sort of similar kind of effect that we saw in the Bayesian case, that you have worse performance overall gives you something like the relative effect, better performance overall gives you something like the absolute version. Okay, so this is perfect. We don't need to do anything else, right? Except for that, this only works when the average rate of the stimulus is very, very close to the spontaneous rate of the model. Right? So when I move away from that, then everything breaks down. Right? So now we're kind of only doing better than the SOA. It's still like the concentration levels are pretty low, and the model doesn't do the task very well. So it breaks down pretty quickly. Okay, so then maybe the Wilson-Gallon model is not the right way to go, right? And so we tried to look at some other models to see what would work well. And so we went to the Jazzieri team. They have a nice model of prediction in time that doesn't use oscillators at all. It uses a predictive ramp. What it does is to take, depending on the amount of input to this system, it can generate a ramp which is meant to hit some threshold at different times, depending on the input that you give to the system. And so, yeah, so here's an example of the same model running over the same trial over a couple times. Here's the ramp, and you can see how it kind of changes its input. So it kind of looks oscillatory, but that's only because of the stimulus input that's driving it. Okay, so how does this behave? So here's some many simulations with reducing the amount of noise in the system. We can see that it performs the task very well, but it doesn't have the sort of dip below zero that we're looking for that has evidence for the prior. And when we look at it relative to different frequencies, actually does go between the different ranges, but in a very different kind of way. So it shows that 4 hertz is something more like relative, and 1.2 and 2 hertz is something more like absolute. So it's a good model. It's a very good model. It explains lots of different things. It just doesn't explain our data. Okay, so now that we have these two things, we have like a speed adjustable ramp, which performs the task well, but doesn't do what we're looking for. And we have a neural oscillator, which does what we're looking for, but doesn't perform the task well. And so what we decide to do, put them together and sort of generate a frequency adjustable oscillator, right? That allows us to actually simulate this. So that's exactly what we did. So now we take the same Wilson-Cowan model, same oscillator, and we just add a few equations that change this input here, which can determine the natural frequency of the oscillator based on the stimulus input and the rates between different stimulus inputs. So here's an example of how this looks. So this is the adaptation signal. This is the synchronization to the stimulus. You can see before you let the adapter change, it doesn't synchronize well, but once you allow it to adapt, it synchronizes. So then we put it through all the same stuff, have it simulate the human data, and lo and behold, it actually does a pretty good job, right? So it's both showing us the frequency effect and also showing us this dip below zero, that's significant below zero. Another thing that the model does well, most surprisingly, is predict some features of neural data, right? So in particular, this model suggests that you should have some neurons, let's say, that synchronize to the input, and you should have some neurons that code for the stimulus rate in its overall amplitude. And so we did some work with Benjamin Morillon. It's some intracranial data where we it was actually for a separate project where we were playing music at a number of different note rates, and we found some electrodes shown in blue here, which code for it in the amplitude, and some electrodes shown in red, which synchronize to the input. So it's actually doing a pretty good job of explaining neural data, although there's much work to be done to actually see, you know, what's the relationship between these, who's feeding into who. So this gives you a sort of multi-level explanation of temporal prediction in my strong terms for the day, which shows both that the behavior of these subjects is quite strange, I think, but it's actually explained well by Bayesian modeling and can be assumed by an oscillator. Okay, and so I think this means that we can consider oscillations in this context as a means of sort of hard-coded rhythmic prior. I say hard-coded in the sense that it's biological, it comes from the system, but it's used to under the prediction that rhythmic things will occur in the environment. And so the only thing that's required is to figure out at what rate this will come, right? And so in this case, you know, I've shown here that the expectations that we have, the prior here, are used to bias your sensory measurement towards the posterior. And we've done some work showing that that's essentially what gives you synchronization to begin with in an oscillator, that you get different phase responses depending on the phase at which the input comes in, right? So in this case, the same input comes as the oscillation is falling, and so it sort of inhibits the system and leads to a phase lag. In this case, when it comes as you're already advancing, it increases the system, and so you get a phase advancement, right? So that allows you to sort of feed everything back towards where the prediction should be. Right, and so it just it requires a bit more work to say actually building the phase response curve that actually best fits the prior in that case. An important question of that is how do we deal with competence in this case? And I think there's multiple ways that we can go, but I think one useful one is to think about oscillators and as multiple neurons oscillating separately, and the sort of competence being sort of about the spread of activation in those cases. Although we can talk about other possibilities. Okay, how am I doing on time? I should probably end pretty soon, huh?
No, take your time.
Okay, I'll take my time.
I mean, do we have, I don't know whether we have constraints actually.
Well, people have other things they want to do. I can bring up some other slides, you know, we can talk for sure.
I mean, I think we started late at 5 past, so probably ending at 1 past, including discussion. Was that something
Okay,
that you're
yeah.
flexible?
Yeah, but I don't have that much left, although I can add some stuff. Okay, so that's sort of these two go together, and this one's a little bit different. Right? This is actually to ask the question, you know, how do we actually combine these predictions in time and content, which are generally in the field considered separately, but must actually interact. And so, I think the first aside is to say, I think the work that I've just shown you has lots of applications to meaningful deviations, right? And so the things like in speech, so I showed you an example, examples I used here were fully randomized deviations from rhythmicity, but of course, speech has more meaningful deviations, right? You don't just randomly decide how long each of your syllables should go, but instead they can be related either to what you think is important, or the end of a sentence, or maybe even linguistic groupings, depending on the case. And so I know you guys are doing some work on that, so we should talk more about that later. So one thing I think would be interesting to do is then apply these models to those corpora and see actually, can you read out meaningful deviations in this way, right? So you can take, for example, the timing of each syllable and map where they are in phase of the synchronization and use that to group, for example, this is one word and that's a second word, for example. You can use that to maybe generate expectations and look at the deviation in both of these two kinds of models. And so there I'm thinking particularly about Sonia and Andrea Martin's work, which have shown that even using a simple sine wave oscillator, which has none of this flexibility amount to it, you can actually use that to read out how predictive the next word should be. So when you have a strong prediction about what it should be, then you have actually an adjustment in phase phase advancement into the system. Right? And so I think this is a useful way to go. And so part of that work requires really understanding the predictions in content, which is much more difficult than it is to do in time, which is a lot of why I work with time. But I'm trying to advance my skills, get into this ChatGPT and large language model world that we now all have to live in, but also take advantage of the fact that these models all of a sudden are getting really good at dealing with sequences. And so maybe we actually need to see what we can learn from them. Right, so here are just a couple example models. I've deliberately not chosen the ones that aren't free. I think pretty sure Quebec is free, which can do automatic speech recognition, text generation, and music transcription. I have an example which is sadly in French, but can show you that just by giving it like this kind of prompt, you can get a pretty good definition of predictive coding, which in this case is an audio coding mechanism that codes the difference between the audio signal, the original audio signal, and an estimation of it, a predictive filter of the signal from which the signal can be reconstructed and the errors passed and utilized, right? So that's just not bad. So the question is, how can we use these to actually learn something in a cognitive sense, let's say, right? And so I'm going to go back to my questions of why and how, right? So I think typically what's done in the field is at this level, right? You generally take the different layers of your model, right? So this is like the Jim DeCarlo kind of thing, right? So you take the early layers of your deep neural net are related to the sort of early visual regions, and the later ones to the later visual regions. You can actually correlate one by one. Here's an example using wave to vec, which shows that they can basically explain the entire brain, right, from the beginning to the end. So like our job is kind of done. So the question is, at what R value will we be satisfied that we actually understand something? And to me, I would say that we will not be satisfied, and that's because we don't actually understand the layers of the model, right? So we've got really good correlation. We can predict all this lovely stuff, but I'm still missing something, right? This is something we don't understand here. And there's lots of good work being done trying to understand this stuff, which is like developed into its own field of machine psychology. So what I think we can do is take advantage more at the Y level. Why is that? It's because the cost functions that we use is what we actually understand about the model, right? We actually give it a task, and we train it on that task, and we say, can you do this thing, right? And so I think we can use that to map not to the how level. Sorry, I didn't mention this. This is an example of a how explanation in the human, in the animal, right? So this one is using delay lines to explain sound localization, particularly well worked out in the barn owl. In the case of Y, I'm going to use David Popel's blobology of speech perception, right? So that you have an idea about what each brain region is trying to accomplish. For example, phonological networks, lexical interface, combinatorial networks. And so I think this is where we can actually get a lot of good out of these kinds of models. And I'm just going to show you one example that we've come up with to try to make this work. And so, yeah, so let's call this cognitive. Okay, so what we've done now is to take two different kinds of deep neural networks. Well, actually, it's the same deep neural network, but just with different kinds of features. So this one is from Google Magenta. It's called Performance RNN and is designed to generate music. That's all it does, right? And it's not bad at it. But what it does is do this in a particularly non-human way, which is to treat time as if it's another note on the keyboard, right? So you have pitch note, like pitch on events, time shift events, and pitch off events, and it operates on one event at a time. And that's basically an engineering trick to get the system to work, because otherwise it's hard to do with polyphony. So it works well. So here's just an example. Let's do this. So well is just maybe a strong word, but also this is now actually a little bit out of date. Right? These things move that very. But you can see that it's learned scales, it's learned something about timing, although it doesn't keep that consistent over time. But on the other hand, we've been working with Benjamin's team, in this case, Paul Long, who's built another version of this model in which the innards are exactly the same, but we deal with time in a slightly more realistic way, right? So now you're actually operating over time samples, and each node you're making a prediction over in that time, right? And so it's actually not designed to generate music, it's just designed to make predictions. And so here's just a little video of what that looks like. Without sound, but it will play. So here's the stimulus. Here are the predictions of the model at every time point. And you can see that it's learning things like scales, right? You can see that there are some notes that are not likely, some that are. You can see that it learned things like proximity, that neighboring notes are more likely than others, and that it adjusts more quickly in fast cases, right? So it's getting some sense of time as well. So, this is like backed by the team of Google, and this is like Paul, but like still it does pretty well, right? And so what we did was to take these kind of musical stimuli, feed them into a MIDI, we'll get the MIDI files from them, feed that into the oscillator, sorry, wrong part of the talk, feed that into the recurrent neural network, and use that to predict various features of human data. And I'll just show you a couple examples. So for example, and this is using the Performance RNN version, behavioral ratings. So first with behavioral ratings, you can see that these models do a pretty good job of explaining subject ratings of how surprised they are in the music over a course of a stimulus. So here's one example from our network versus Idiom, which is the standard version these days. It's work that I do with Pablo and Claire at NYU. Can do the same thing to encode neural predictions. It does a better job explaining neural predictions than Idiom, again, from their data. And that made us feel comfortable enough that we could, because Idiom is only really designed for monophonic music, that we could do the same thing in polyphonic music ourselves. And so, which again shows that it's encoding for more features. What's nice is that this also makes predictions at the same time of pitch and timing events. And so we can show that you can separately track each of these two things. And this is work that Mathieu is doing, who's one of our students at the IDEA, all this data collected at ICM. Okay, but so this is the interesting part. Okay, so the performance RNN works. That's what I've shown you so far. But now let's consider actually how well these models, the sort of entropy of these models, how certain they can be at each note, how well that progresses over the MEG data. So here's the performance RNN version, which is like okay but noisy, right? You have some cases like around 400 milliseconds that seem to deal well with this, but this is really a prediction method, which is actually the prediction that's generated here about this note, right? So this 0 is when the prediction is actually generated and stuff. Okay, now we consider Paul's model, which deals with time in a realistic way. And you can see that even though it's like us against David and Goliath, it's Paul against Google, the model actually does a pretty good job of explaining a lot more of the data here. And so I think that's, it's early days here. But I think thinking more about not the internal parts of the model, but actually the cross functions and the upper layers that we actually can explain can allow us to probe different kinds of questions about how, for example, pitch and time should be integrated. But you can imagine the same thing in speech, looking at, what can, like, how do you integrate language information as opposed to acoustic information. So that's kind of interesting should use. And so, there's many different other kinds of hypotheses you can generate about how these two things should be integrated. So that means many models that we can use as a means of this hypothesis. Okay, so we showed that deep neural nets seem to outperform the current state of the art. We can show that building models with different representational formats can allow us to probe internal representations and their dynamics. And our next work will then be to sort of try to decompose these time and frequency predictions and relate them to the neural signatures that I talked about in the beginning of this talk, right? The low frequency synchronization and things like phase amplitude coupling, things like beta, top down again. So this is all that good stuff. Okay, I think that's a good stopping point, although if you want more, I can give you more. All right, thanks very much.
Yeah, online people, if you have questions, please raise a hand. There's two.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk.
Yeah.
A number of questions, but one was that mostly the whole theory, at least in the first part, is based on perception.
Yeah.
And production is, I mean, just there might be the problem if we talk about speed, but also about music, that production is also limited by certain time windows.
Yeah.
Which you motor and whatever, anything which you produce is limited by fastness, how fast you can move your muscles. So that would be one question, also related to the last one, where the Google thing was actually productive, whereas the other one is receptive.
Yeah.
I think that's a large difference. Can you probably briefly comment?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work which suggests that a lot of our predictive apparatus, in fact, is related heavily to our motor system, right? So, and I think the model actually gives a good example of that. How does the model actually generate music? It makes predictions giving an input, and then it samples from that set of predictions in order to choose which will be the next note, right? So all we've done in that case is to just extract out what the prediction is and then use that. In fact, they're trained on the same task, which is prediction, right? And so I agree with you that the motor system is a key point of this, and we have, specifically in time perception, we know that the motor system is actually generating a lot of those predictions. Or no, but we suspect that the motor system is generating a lot of those predictions. So I think it's heavily related.
I was wondering, because there is time compressed speech basically, which you can still understand, but should completely violate your prediction. I mean,
but to a point, right? So it's not that. So there's lots of good work that shows that. There's some good work that shows that. Once you get past 3 times compression, you start to lose your range, and then just by adding like white spaces into that, so you keep it compressed, but you just add silence in between at a regular period, you can get that back, right? And so that suggests that it's not purely about how compressed the signal is, right? But also about
but I was just wondering whether probably because the production, I think it very hard for you to perform time compressed speech at a rate faster than 3 times your normal speech level.
Yes.
So it's probably a stupid question about hen and egg, but the question is limitation why we are working in this kind of, it always sounds like it's done by the neurons and therefore we can speech like that.
Yeah.
Maybe it's also because the production system is not going to be faster and thereby has the optimum between fastness and information transfer. That was one idea.
Yeah, so it's not a dumb question, of course. It's one that we think about a lot, or like wish we could answer. One piece of evidence in favor of the neural component is that the time constraints are the same in earlier species, not earlier species, but in different species, right? And so there you have different motor systems, which all sort of lead to the same kind of thing. Like even like songbirds also are about like 5 hertz. Like, why should that be? So yeah, I think that's probably the sort of case why we think it's sort of more the system being sort of adapted to the neural architecture, or the speech being adapted to the neural architecture rather than the other way around. But of course they evolve together. So like it's, you know, it's hard to say one way or the other.
Both questions.
I wanted to ask, is your LSTM model available like here somewhere since it performs better?
The performance RNN model.
Yeah.
So that is Google it's fully available open source. And also there are ones that are better now, like the music transformer and stuff. So and the recent paper with Kern showed this is on that. For Paul's model, it's not yet available.
Yeah, that was my question, because Paul seems to be doing better than Google.
Well, don't tell them that. Maybe don't. Can we edit that part out? Maybe. Yeah. So like soon, I think we're sort of writing up the paper now and stuff. So yeah, it can be made available in the near future.
More questions online or in the room? Hey, just.
Oh, there are chats here too. Sorry.
Okay. Somehow following up on what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
Also, I'm a medical doctor, so I deal with patients, and so
Yeah.
my question was whether aphasic speech, for example, which is classically a rhythmic in a way,
Yeah.
which is not intended,
Mhm.
and production is very often much more impaired than perception.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any studies which look into that? Because I mean,
Which look into what exactly? Into the perception of aphasic speech?
yeah, at the most basic level, it would be something that you just look into the rate of aphasic speech production, whether
Yeah.
that falls out of the range of this like apparently universal rhythm of language.
Yeah.
And secondly, whether probably could actually get a foot to the door, as we say, to understand the question, what is productive and which one is the receptive,
Mhm.
because they're usually not hearing impaired, so that is not the problem.
Yeah.
Their production is usually more impaired than the perception. You might even find patients who are able to dissociate.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any?
I'm not aware of any data on the aphasic corpus, for example. Yeah. Then it would be an interesting idea to look at. But you know, I think the question of like, you know, and I'm not sure if this is what you're asking, but it reminds me a lot of like questions of like motor theories of speech perception. Like, you know, and in that case, we kind of know like, you know, the perception seems to be the priority, right? As far as like,
I'm just, I think probably also from the perception is generally the lesser challenge.
right.
Production is less difficult, especially if we are talking about meaningful positional speech.
Right.
And so that's why I'm asking, because that perception is much easier to examine.
Yeah.
Certainly, also in your models. But I think the crucial point is production. The challenging point is production. Sorry.
Well, I would say they're both pretty challenging.
Right.
At least from from where I am as a fundamental perspective, like trying to build something that actually works is actually quite difficult. That said, I think there's, you know, if what you should actually do is look at the work from Florencia and also a bit Ben, who have worked a lot on the sensory motor interactions, and showing that this kind of coupling that we talk about in relative from the, you know, the speech signal to the auditory cortex also feeds to the auditory motor cortex. And so, you know, what role that plays is a question, but in terms of actually, you know, the other thing that it makes me think of is the, you know, and one thing that we were talking about earlier is that, you know, we also have to consider, like, you know, for example, okay, so why do we not speak perfectly rhythmically, right? Given that we're in sort of oscillator case. And the idea is that, okay, you actually have to deal also with the producer, right? And so the producer also is, who is, you know, it's almost as if your goal as a listener is to predict as best you can and make the thing as easy as possible. And it's the goal of the producer to make you pay attention and be surprised, right? And so there's this sort of tension between the two. But yeah, in terms of actually how that works, yeah, it's not quite, you know,
Probably not the phasics that you would like to have as target group, probably stuttering, and not like people who have been stuttering for 30 years, but people who just, well, kids basically. Because in adults it would already be plastic, or plasticity would have already like it, and so you cannot dissociate the efference copy from the auditory signal, from the faulty premotor response in stuttering. And I think that's why in the adult literature you have all this ambiguity. So you could imagine like someone just started to stutter, to study that more closely, to see what's the chicken and what's the egg. But so far the literature hasn't been particularly successful.
I look for pause production because you get different patterns of pause production for Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And then you can basically compare different kinds of aphasia and look how that affects pause production, because pauses are kind of really reliable and they do not change across the lifespan. Some children produce pauses at similar rates as adults do, so they're a good diagnostic of speech rate and also changes in speech rate local. I have a question on the mechanistic model, because you had the Yamin's network there. So you kind of dismissed the deep neural network, and I can see your point. I mean, there are other ways of working with neural network, working with not just working with correlations, but taking a layer out of the deep network and taking some brain data and splitting it and looking whether that really resolves. But we're not limited to these deep models, actually. And when it comes to time, it could be simpler models might actually work, something like a Kalman filter or a Woodrow-Hoff. So you're not totally against them.
So yeah, I perhaps was overly strong in my rejection of deep learning, deep models, and also I'm not rejecting them. I'm using them. So, but the these models are doing awesome stuff, and they I'm speaking sort of tongue in cheek about this kind of stuff, but like, there's few things that give you this kind of correlation of this data, right? And so it's clearly working well, and particularly can be really useful for things like PCI, right? For for more engineering purposes, you really can use these models for a lot of things. So I'm not saying this work shouldn't be done. I'm saying that the work is heavily focused here particularly for AI models, and that I think we ignore the fact that this is actually what we understand. And so why not use the sort of higher layers that are actually designed by us in order to probe the different kinds of things that we also don't know what each one of these brain regions is supposed to do, right? So why not also spend a little bit of our resources on this, right? And it's a much less engineering question, and a lot of these deep learning models are designed by engineers, and so it makes sense that we're at this space. But I think that we can use this in an interesting way that I'm not gonna say it hasn't been done, but it is heavily understudied.
I agree.
I still think that this level is an important one, right? And so that I just don't think that the AI models are the best ones to be done there. In fact, I think a lot of what I showed you today is at this level, using simple oscillators and this kind of stuff. But things that you actually can handcraft enough that you can actually understand what the mechanism is. Whereas here, yes, there's stuff that you can do in order to understand these middle layers, but I think the further up you get, the less clear it becomes, right? Like you always people show like layer one, okay, now we see like orientation the same way we did before, and then you get to layer two, and it's like textures, and then right, and so like it's extremely effective, should be used, and like they're doing things a lot better than anything else that we've come up with. However, I think that they're depends on what your goal is. Like if your goal is to understand cognition, I think that this might be better.
But they're not mutually exclusive. You can use the full stack in Mark terms.
Exactly. Yeah, but I think it means that it's a different kind of experiment, right? And you have to build different kinds of models with different kinds of cost functions to see actually which one does best, right? So it's not just a matter of like taking the Jim DiCarlo work and just applying this to it, right? You just have to, you have to start from the beginning with a different goal. That's the only point I'm saying, although I think both are useful. How political was that?
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Great.
I have one or two questions, if I may, if there's nothing else online or in the room. And sorry. Yeah, oh, chat, there's someone in the chat. Can you check in the chat? Sorry, I didn't, yes, thank you, Dr.
No, I think it's just people leaving.
Just people leaving, right?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll just bravely ask one of the. The first one, and it's too bad that Kanat Manke, who was with Usha Goswami, has already left the building. And you know, of course, that Usha's work is part of it is about amplitude rise times, and how they relate to the tracking, the synchronization. Now you're showing these beautiful data with a smooth attack.
Yeah.
And I was struck by that actually. I mean, wouldn't that, if I understood it right, it says that the smoother the smoother attack gives you a benefit basically for synchronizing, right?
So yeah, it's a great point, and it highlights that I disagree with myself. Because in my original the neuroimage paper about speech comprehension, you show that the sharper the attack, the more you synchronize. But here I'm saying the opposite. I guess what I would say is that in the modeling work, that is more of a trick to make the oscillator reveal itself, right? By reducing the amount of evoked response on the signal. Doesn't necessarily mean that the oscillator is synchronizing more, although that's possible. But it means that you have less of the evoked response, which is what's biasing our performance away from that. Yeah.
I was just wondering, I mean, you could come up with a research hypothesis, if you would think there's something to it, and I've never thought about like Goswami's data and data from that lab in that way, but you could speculate about an optimal angle there, and it's probably not the steepest, and it's probably not the smoothest either, and I don't recall anyone having ever investigated whether the syllables or syllable structures or something like that in the languages of the world, whether there's a theoretical maximum in steepness, say, that your articulators can do, theoretical maximum of pressure building up behind your teeth or whatever. So what's the maximum that you can make with your mouth? And what's the level that you actually find in the languages of the world? And maybe we're not even pushing it to the maximum. I mean, we're not constantly doing pop, peep, pop, pop, poo.
Yeah, I think that.
Right? But something you're living in France now, and people are very smooth. Yeah, so it's not a
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. But that could be studied. I'm just saying it could be a legitimate and interesting research direction, actually.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we have talked about briefly, I showed the kind of oscillator stuff here, talking about the phase response curve and how timing and things works. Another thing that this paper does is talk about waveform shape, right? And so, like I myself have conflated speech, music, like wood blocks, like all those are completely different kinds of waveform shapes. And when you deal with just a simple oscillator on its own, it's going to respond very differently to those kinds of signals. And so that's a problem for us. And we have to figure out, okay, well, what kind of normalization features do you want to add beforehand in order to make things synchronize in a more stable way, or do you want that? But it also means, so like, for example, the thing that you synchronize the best to is, of course, a sine wave. And like a speech signal is kind of close to that, right? Because it has peaks and troughs and peaks and troughs and this kind of thing. So it's a continuous signal that you're always synchronizing to. And so I think from, just from what you were saying kind of reminded me of that, because, I think in the music case, the smooth version is probably actually closer to that than the sharp attack, which is more of like a sawtooth kind of thing. Whereas you can find very, like for the same frequency, same input, everything, if you give like a sine wave or speech signal versus something just like this, it will get completely unstable kinds of responses. So that's something that we have to think about. And in particular to decide, should we be grouping these things or not, right? It's a very different kind of task to track this versus something that's going, right? That you never have to actually, like, you can rely a lot more on the stimulus in the second. And so, yeah, so one of the things that I'm like, not next week, but at some point I would like to do is rerun this study, but actually start to change those waveform shapes and see, and because also that will tell you something about the certainty about when something actually occurs. Will actually manipulate your sensory measurements for the timing anyways.
Yes. You should also, once you do that, you should also consider environmental noise. Like when you think about animal communication systems, there's this beautiful book actually by Douglas Adamson, this Son of the Hitchhikers. It's like a book about dying animals and how they get extinct. And now the problem with staying alive is environmental noise when you want to mate. And when you have populations spreading apart into few individuals, and say you live on a stormy island, you can't hear the mating call. It happens actually to like giant ground breeding parrots. That's the funny one. And now in typology and like geographical linguistics, people are using that to model factors of phonetic systems. Right? When say you live up on a mountain and you're a culture where it's constantly windy, or you have barriers, so you have a totally different phonetic system from someone living on the ground, basically. Right? And so that could also, when I think about convolution, probably in Western culture, we all have about the same noise levels on average, subways, lecture halls, whatnot. But that could also be a factor that affects actually the natural rise times that we are actually faced with outside the lab.
Right.
So they're certainly smoother. That's what I want to say. When you think about the convolution and noisy environments, everything gets automatically blurred. Right. So that could help, basically. Probably your recording from a mouth suggests a sharper attack time than you actually have in your everyday life. Just a speculation.
Yeah, no, it's a good point.
I think it's an opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, it also reminds me of Luke's work on screams, right? So, which is like, it has this idea of, it has particular modulation features, which is like a niche that's reserved for emergency stuff.
Yeah.
Right? And that's why we have this kind of
niche is the right term. Niche is.
So maybe I should have screams at random rates.
Probably. Sounds like it's interesting.
It's a big collaboration.
Yeah. The second question I had.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why I have that question. In the mismatch negativity literature, people have been trying to see how many stimuli in a row you need to know in order to establish a new prior. So you don't need like 20 standards and then an oddball. Apparently about 3 to 4 is enough to change your expectation. And within an MMN experiment, when you do something like a moving window, and when you talked about timing and stable averages, and we talked about that like earlier today, right? I was wondering, relative versus absolute. Say your experiment only lasts for 3 trials, then you have the same time window. And could you kind of tease that? How many trials do you need in order to arrive at an internal hypothesis about rhythm? Say you do something like an irregular rhythm of 3 notes, like something like that. Is that enough for telling me the next one will be at the average interval?
So it is enough to make a prediction, but not a very good one, right? So like, this is the it's here. No, let me not. So, and that's sort of what this shows, right? It's like in the first 2 tones, you get no prediction. On the third tone, you have a prediction, but it's just a very wide range, right? Because you just don't know what's going on. And then as you get more and more information, you get more and more stable until you get to the point where you have to take into account that the experiment is always adding jitter. So you can never be 100%, like you can be confident about where the mean is, but in terms of where the tone is actually going to occur is going to always have a certain amount of noise. And so, the idea is that you should build up that confidence over time. But of course, a reasonable question is like, if I give you 50 tones, like probably the first 2 don't matter anymore, right? But we haven't really gotten to that point. In the beginning phases of the study, although I haven't done it since a lot of things have changed, we looked at the weighting of the time, to see actually Like, can we actually weight these, set weights and try to fit the data better? Using 10 tones was basically fully overfitting, but you can actually group them by sections of beginning phase, middle phase, early phase. It didn't seem to make a difference. At least at the case of 10 tones, you're still using it, and weirdly enough, equally, you seem to be using them all together. Although, of course, we didn't design the experiment for that, so we could actually try to separately manipulate each one of these tones. Because we also, side note, we made sure that the last tone was heavily distal from the expected time. Because that's what allows you to really separate absolute from relative. And so that also can give that more, can mess with how you would normally weight things. So we could try that in another way.
Also think about different populations. I'm thinking, I know it's a bad example probably, but there's people who believe that, say you have a more predictive brain, one where you have a shift in excitation inhibition balance, for instance, and this person has an extremely rhythmic processing system, so it's predicting stuff. Someone who's either very stubborn or sick. Would they show a different willingness to extract stable error? They just override it straight away and say, I don't know, I know what's going to happen. So
it reminds me of two things. One is that I'm doing a collaboration with Brad Wojtek, who's has a lot of stuff on the waveform shape, and so we're trying to see they've shown that relates to EI balance stuff. I'm also trying to see if does that relate to cognition in any kind of way. So we do this kind of study, but just with 2, 3, or 4 tones, which gives you more and more confidence as you go, and see does the cycle shape change?
Yes.
So I'll let you know. The other thing, so one of the things that we're thinking about now is, can we apply this to cases like autism or schizophrenia where predictions are disordered? And so particularly in autism, the role of kind of predictive coding kind of measures have different ideas about which components are most likely to be disordered, overly precise sensory measurements versus overly precise expectations. And so let's see if we can run them on this task and see if one of them is overly precise. And so I think who knows if that will work, but I think that's sort of a useful way of just trying to distinguish between different people to see actually how much do their expectations and measurements get weighed. The other thing that we're doing now is applying this kind of expectation stuff to audiology, we talked about before, and trying to see, actually what we show is that the ability to predict can change the decibel level that you get for pure tone detection thresholds. And so what we'd like to do next is to see how does that change over the course of age, right? So with more information that you get, you're more reliant on your expectations. With less sensory input, like if you have progressive sensory degradation, do you rely more on your expectations to cope and to hide your deficit until you can no longer do so. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there to see actually how do individual differences affect this kind of relationship.
I remember there's also a population of people who are not schizophrenic, but they still do have hallucinations. Don't remember what.
Sorry, but your next meeting is in 5 minutes.
Oh no!
Oh, there's a hand.
There's a hand.
Yes, Joy Mills, please.
Hi, no, I just was really enjoying that individual differences question and wondering if you, since you've been working with Asanio, if you looked at her high and low synchronizer sort of bimodal populations at all.
With Florencia, so I have not. I think that's, boom, let's write a grant. Or maybe you can do it.
Done. Let's do it.
That's a great idea. And we could maybe see actually, if high and low synchronizer gets you, more absolute or more relative. It's perfect because Florencia is already on this paper, so she's into it anyways.
Hey. Cool.
Yeah. Boom, new paper.
Next.
Yeah, exactly. Just get ChatGPT to write it.
Okay, thank you again, Keith.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you also people in the audience. and in the room. See you next time at the language circle.